back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the young adult fantasy novel Firian Rising, and this is English Nerd. So today I wanted to talk to you about naming characters, different ways that you can name characters well. It's one of those things that for many of us is pretty difficult to do. I find myself looking up names all the time, even for minor characters. So here are some of the things that you might want to keep in mind and some of the resources and strategies that you can use as you're naming your own characters. So number one, keep in mind your genre, your location, and your time period as well. So for instance, if you have a historical work that you're writing and it's set in the 1920s, then you probably won't have super modern names associated with that. You'd have more Williams and Franks and names set in that particular time period. You can actually go to different websites and search baby names by decade, so that could be a resource for you, but you really should make sure to, at least to keep your book realistic, to keep your names squarely in that time period. Place also matters, of course. The names Frank and William, of course, were popular in the 1920s in America, but if you're writing a story that's set in India, then obviously your names are going to look quite different. So keep that in mind as well, where your book is set. Don't just default to whatever nationality you are, right? If you're me, don't default to American, white. Instead, make sure that you're actually matching the person and the place that you are writing in. Also keep in mind your genre. I mentioned historical fiction, but I write fantasy fiction, so I have a bit more leeway with names, but I still have to keep in mind where in my fantasy world are these people coming from. The names from one nation will not sound exactly the same as names from another nation. I want to separate those out, even if it's in a small way. So for instance, there is a group of people in Firian Rising called the Kelly that only go by a first name. They don't have last names. It's part of their cultural identity. So keep in mind the genre that you're writing and make sure that your names add to the believability of whichever genre you're working on. A second thing to consider as you're naming characters is the meaning of the names. Now, it's not necessary that you look at the meaning of a name before you name a character. That would just be far too much work, and a lot of names are made up anyway. Firian doesn't have a particular name or meaning that I'm aware of anyway. But it can be helpful if you are trying to create a particular kind of character to look up names by meaning. So one place that I've gone in the past that's a really helpful resource is parenthood.com. They have a list of names that you can search by first letter, last letter, meaning, nationality, and you can really mix up some search criteria that way, which is fantastic. I do occasionally get ads for new babies and things like that on Pinterest, which is not super relevant to me, but I don't really care because the names are extremely helpful. So you can look things up by meaning. You can also create some Easter eggs that way. I know some writers who like to not give spoilers exactly, but like to weave in some hidden aspect of a person's personality in the meaning of the name. So if you think about J.K. Rowling, she does this all the time. Basically, you can figure out what the twists are in the story if you can figure out what she's doing with the names. So Remus Lupin, for instance, both of those names have a very close connection phonetically, or I don't know if it's phonetically, but the root words of both of those names mean wolf. Right? So maybe you didn't know what the twist was at the beginning, but by the end it starts to come together. So some people really like to put in those Easter eggs with the names. I do that a little bit with Firian Rising, not a ton, but there are a couple characters that are very intentionally named something that has to do with their personality. Okay, so some naming pitfalls to avoid. You want to avoid creating names that are too difficult to say. This is especially true with fantasy writing. Sometimes people get all excited about some new type of name that they've created, but if you can't say it or sound it out, then it distances the reader from the character. So even if it's something really unusual, at least have it be pronounceable, right? Firian is a name that most people can pronounce correctly the first time around, or at least they can have a guess that feels right to them without thinking, man, that's too many consonants or something. So have your names pronounceable as much as possible. Try to avoid names that are too similar as well. I know if you're like me, then you tend to gravitate toward a certain sound of name and or maybe a certain letter. When I was growing up, I love names that started with J, like so many of my characters and name ideas that would come to mind would start with J, but you don't want every character to start with J or people are going to get them confused. Even if you have them very clearly differentiated in your own head, it's best to give some variety to your characters. I know I could have done that better with Firian Rising, but by the time I realized that, the ship had kind of sailed, and I'm just going to stick with what I have and do better in the future. So avoid similar names, especially when you're introducing multiple characters at once. That can really throw people for a loop. Very confusing. You also want to avoid certain things, like if you give a middle name to your character, maybe it's one of those 3-name kind of people, try to avoid having their initials spell out like KKK or something like that, because obviously that's just some unintentional badness right there. Or something that sounds like a negative term if you say it a certain way. So just observe your names, make sure that there's no unintentional badness happening there. Okay, a couple of hints just to leave you with. I know I have my handy dandy notebook here again. I'm so old school. I don't use my phone for this kind of thing. I just use a notebook. But anyway, so some hints. Use variety, like I've said before. Not only of sound, but also of nationality as well. Unless there's a very particular reason why everybody in your story is white or everybody in your story is from Ghana or something like that. Use some variety. There's variety in real life, and so make sure that you use variety and don't always default to your own experience with names. Branch out and see what else is out there. Consider naming conventions of the culture that you're creating or using that is actually real. For instance, certain cultures will give multiple middle names depending on what saints are important on the day that the person is born. Or in Russia, you have a patronymic. That middle name is often a form of the father's first name, but with a different ending. So Alexandrovich, for instance. In my culture, I have the one culture that does not have last names at all. Or you even think about Scottish or Irish that have that O'Malley or Macduff, the O or the Mac, to show that that was an ancestor of that family. So keep those things in mind. Don't just go with something that feels super familiar necessarily, but branch out a bit. If you found any other naming tips that are really helpful, put those in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, of course, do so. Like this video if you like it, and I will see you next Monday.